I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers. Sarah Podemski is an award-winning multidisciplinary artist from Toronto. She stars in 3 seasons of the critically acclaimed Spirit Award-winning and Emmy-nominated series Reservation Dogs, and she can also be seen in 3 seasons of the sci-fi comedy Resident Alien. Rebecca Clarren is the author of The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance, which was named a Best Book by Kirkus Reviews in 2023, the Forward, Tribal College Journal, and the Christian Science Monitor. She's been writing about the American West for more than 25 years. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to hand things over to our speakers, who'll be out in a second. Thank you.
Everyone.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Thanks for coming.
Good to see you all today.
So I'm Sarah, and I had the pleasure of interviewing, I guess, Rebecca for the Weitzman. Was it like a year ago, maybe?
Yeah, a little over a year ago.
And I read the book, and coming from my background, my father is Ashkenazi, my grandfather is a Holocaust survivor, and then my mother is Anishinaabe, which is Ojibwe from Canada, and her parents were residential school survivors. I read this book and was kind of in awe at how I was able to read a book that had these 2 intertwining histories, that I have this, Jewish native legacy that is rare. I meet a few native Jews here and there, but it was kind of the first time that I had seen these histories written so beautifully together. And when I read the book for the first time, I felt like there was a key here that unlocked a really important conversation about our legacy as Jews coming to America and Canada, and kind of what land we came to, and what we know and what we don't know, and all these things. And I thought the book was just such a beautiful exploration and dialogue, and how we can start relearning about how we got here and how our families got here.
I love that term, relearning. Well, it's been wonderful to continue the conversation over the last year. I'm Rebecca. Thank you so much for being here. And I love that you got that. It's kind of why we write books, is hoping people find themselves on the page. I always think the job of a writer is to be having a conversation with strangers, hopefully, through the page. So it's amazing to be here in a room of good readers today.
So what led you on this journey?
Well, I was born, just kidding, we won't go that far back, but I grew up hearing these amazing stories of my Jewish homesteading ancestors on the South Dakota prairie. And there were sort of these stories I think of as like our greatest hits. There was the one about my Uncle Louis who could stand on the back of a horse, or the one about my cousin who, this is the story, when he was 5, he every morning would clear a path from the claim shack to the outhouse of rattlesnakes every day. And then there's the story that people love to tell, especially the women in my family, about my great-great-grandmother Fagetka and how she could, in the winter in South Dakota, so it was like so cold, negative 40 sometimes, she would send her daughters, one of whom is my great-grandmother, who I'm named after, outside to crack the ice with a stick or an axe, and then she would dunk naked in that frigid water. That was her mikveh. This real story about the toughness, this religious commitment. And yet, for all the stories we told and were told growing up, there were no stories about our Native neighbors. The closest reservation to my family's land was only 13 miles away. And yet there were, and 13 miles in Manhattan is a very far distance, but 13 miles on the South Dakota prairie, you know, your closest neighbor could be 2 miles away. So 13 miles is not that big of a distance. It was easily collapsed at a time when the rivers were undammed and you could just go back and forth. And yet we never talked about our Lakota neighbors. And I think that's so important because, of course, the stories we tell and the stories we don't tell equally create the myth we're passing to future generations. I've been a journalist writing about the American West for like 25 years, so I've written over that time about Native nations, and because you just don't cover that region without also covering the people there. And I don't know, it just took me a long time, honestly, to start to notice and get curious about, like, why don't we tell those stories? There must be stories. What's going on? Especially because Daniel will show you in this first slide, this is a photograph. So even though we didn't have stories about my Jewish ancestors and their Native neighbors, there were mysterious photographs like this one that I grew up looking at of my ancestors posing with Native people, or people dressed in full traditional Native regalia. That's my Uncle Jack Sinekin on the left. It's such a weird photo. Like, why is his gun holstered on the outside of his clothes? And he's shaking hands with this man in very traditional dress. You can see he has a pipe bag. He's holding a pipe. He has an eagle, you know, the bonnet on. And so I wanted to know what's going on. This was part of what led me to write this story. And on my earliest visits to some of the reservations in South and North Dakota, tribal historians said, we think the guy in this photo is Joseph White Bull. And Joseph White Bull was a really famous person. He was Sitting Bull's nephew. This photo, I think, was taken in 1919 because there's a photo of my grandmother posing with Jack, who's in that same suit. And that was
his only suit.
It was his only suit, probably. And so, anyway, knowing that this was most likely Joseph White Bull led me to know the White Bull family. And so in this book, The Cost of Free Land, it is what I think of as this entangled history of both my Jewish family and the White Bull family, and then deeply reported to contextualize our family stories. But that's what got me there initially.
Can you speak a bit about where your ancestors came from?
Yeah.
What they were fleeing and how they came to
Yes,
South
I
Dakota?
love that question. So my family is from this small shtetl called Kapulia in what is today, it's near Minsk in what is today Belarus. It's a very tiny shtetl, like maybe 5,000 people total lived there, and yet there are a preponderance of Jews from Kapulia living in America today. I can't tell you how many people I've met who have told me their ancestors are also from Kapulia. And Jewish genealogy right here is how I got connected to some of the other Jews. It turns out when my family went to the South Dakota prairie, they were living not just with members of my family, there were about 70 Jews in all that came there and homesteaded together. They were all from that region of the Pale of Settlement. They all spoke Yiddish. And my great-great-grandfather was in a terrible pogrom. He was beaten to within an inch of his life and left for dead, and luckily didn't die. But the fear of pogroms, the terrible living conditions that they were subjected to, I'm sure many of you who are from that region have similar stories in your family. Like, Jews could not own land where they lived. And Harry, my great-great-grandfather, he was trained as a smith, but he couldn't work with gold and silver. Jews weren't allowed in those guilds, so he could only work with tin and made silverware and like the tops of synagogues and things like that. But so as more fear is coming in, less opportunity for Jews, my family joins the literally millions of Jews leaving Eastern Europe and comes to America in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it was important to me to really write as deep and as wide of a history as I could. And so that's why the book opens not in South Dakota, but in Russia, to help explain why were they coming here and what were they coming with when they arrived. What were they thinking when they got here?
There's similarities to what happened here and what happened in Canada in terms of how the government offered this beautiful free land that was wild and nobody was there. And we want you to come and we want you to farm and we want you to bring your families and we want you to develop this land. And what a dream. What a dream, especially for Jews coming who weren't able to own land and who were fleeing persecution and, fearing for their lives. So what was that like? What did your family think they were coming into when they answered this classified?
Right. Like, we think that, so my family doesn't throw anything away. I literally have nightgowns that are 100 years old. I mean, I have tax returns from 1911. When I was doing research for this book, my Aunt Etta, who recently died, unfortunately, but her house, it doubled as a family museum. And I went there in one weekend. I scanned 1,000 pages of letters and diaries, and many of these letters were written in Yiddish. This is all to say, we think that we know a lot, and there's still a lot we don't know. But the story that was in a letter was that Harry is here, Fagetka is still in Kapulia, and he's saying, there's these signs, that there's free land to be had. And we think that they just had no idea. We think that they thought it was like a dacha, like a country house in Russia. I mean, they had no farming experience. But Fagetka, Harry, for the rest of his life, suffered from that pogrom, terrible health impacts. And so she says in the story, the family story is, oh, you have health trouble. The country will be good for you. You should do it. And he goes out and gets this land and starts living in a cave on the land. And Fagetka, the story is that in our family in Kapulia, our family lived in one of the nicest houses, or if not the nicest house in Kapulia, and which wasn't that nice. But she says to him, I'm not going to live in a cave. You have to build me a house. But the first house they live in was not made of wood or stone. It was made of dirt. And in fact, Daniel, if you want to show the next slide, there's a photo of it. Not that one, the next one after that. We can come back to this one. So do you see in the back that kind of Quonset-shaped structure? That's a sod house. It's made of cut bricks of dirt, and that was what they first lived in when they got to the prairie. So their life was not glamorous when they got there. But
shocking.
It's shocking. It was shocking. Our Uncle Louis, I have some cousins here in the audience. It's very sweet that you guys are here. And our Uncle Louis, our great uncle, he was later interviewed in the 50s by the Jewish Post. And they described him as shuddering as he recalled living in this house. And yet for our family, when they arrive, this is like just a huge, I describe it in the book as like the platform shoes of class. It's such a big deal for them to be landowners in America.
Yeah. And who was on the receiving end of these new people to the area that are seemingly, unknowingly taking this land as an opportunity? Who was there, and how did this affect the community?
Right. So, yeah, there's some thinking. I thought a lot about like, what did my family know about who had been living there? I think it's important just to share sort of the benefit that my family gets. So for them, they get there, they tell their children, living on this land makes us feel like real Americans. And for those of you who don't know, quick history land, the way they were given this land was called the Homestead Act. And it was federal policy, and it just was this law that said you can, if you, in 3 to 5 years, based on when you file for a homestead, if you did what was called proving up, the land, 160 acres would become yours to keep. And you had to improve upon the land. And we now know that like one of the best tools we have of combating climate change is the native intact prairie, because it captures so much carbon emissions. But for the early white explorers to the Great Plains, they looked at these sections of America and said, this is like a desert. We should definitely give it to the Indians, as they called them then, and this is just empty land. And so the American government was like, let's improve, we want you to improve upon this land. And so you were supposed to farm it or become ranchers, which is what our family ends up doing. And they get so much, they feel so American. If you look at the photo before this one, Daniel, if we could just go back. This is what they live in. They live to improve upon the land. They have to build a house on the land. So if we can go back, you can see this, what that meant. And if we can't, it's no big deal. But they built these like 10 by 12 shacks that they would live in. And this is Fagetka of the mikveh fame is on the far right. She's wearing that white, like how did they keep these clothes so white? I have no idea. And that's my Aunt Fanny and this collection of children. They quickly learn what the Lakota had known for a very long time, which was it was very impossible to farm in a dry place when there's no irrigation. And so they get into ranching. And by the 50s, we have a 6,000 acre cattle ranch. And I knew all these stories about the freedoms that my family felt. And actually this historian has said even the Jews who didn't prove up, just having the land was really important to make them metabolize what she calls their suspect immigrant status. Like it made them pass. It made them look more American. But as you know, I wanted to also show the like deep economic impact. Oh, if possible, can we go to the next slide? Maybe there's the thing. So this photo to me is also really amazing, a sign of the freedoms. So these are different relatives of mine. My grandmother Ruth, it says Ruth S. over there, and to her left is, or to her right rather, is our Aunt Rose. And Louis is the little kid on the far side over here in the overalls. But those are women and boys and girls together at school, Jews and non-Jews together at school. That was never happening for them in Russia. Like this photo, I look at that photo and I see their freedom. And just even the girls were at school. But I wanted to show also what was the really big economic impact. So I pulled every single mortgage on our families that our family took out on the land they owned over the time we owned the land. My grandmother and her sisters sold the last bit in 1970, and they got there in about 1905. And you start to see this pattern where they would take out a mortgage, and then they would buy more land, or they would take out a mortgage and they would start a new business. Our relatives get really into owning saloons in the Black Hills, which takes a left turn later, which I read about in the book. And or they would take out a mortgage and they would move. But they this money helped them prosper. And when you add all those mortgages up, it comes to, in today's dollars, $1.1 million. It was not an insignificant amount of money. And 25% of American adults living today descend from homesteaders. There's something like 90 million of us.
Wow.
And that's not even including Canada. And there's a sociologist from Brandeis, his last name is Shapiro, and he wrote a book, and he said, if you can send your kids to college, if you can afford to buy a home, and you descend from homesteaders, it's likely you can do that from the intergenerational wealth accrued. Like, legal scholars have called the Homestead Act the biggest form of affirmative action for white people our country ever passed. Because, of course, this great benefit came at great cost to the Lakota. So, getting back to your very good question from like so many minutes ago, the Lakota had been living on this land for, it's a little, it's a little unclear, but there are stories. The Lakota Nation has stories of being there for a very long time in the area. And in 1851, if you go to the next slide, please, you can see there's a map in the book that kind of shows. So in 1851, this map, I know it's hard to read from far away, but you can see the different lines. And basically it shows the way the Lakota land over less than 60 years changes and changes and changes again. It gets smaller and smaller. And in 1851, the United States signs this first treaty with the Lakota Nation and other Plains nations, promising this largest swath of land will be Lakota land forever. Time in perpetuity, this land will belong to the Lakota. But at the exact same minute, almost, not really, but historically a same minute, California becomes a state. And there's this longing by the railroad companies, which are the most powerful corporation of their time, to create a rail line connecting California with all of its oranges and trees to the East Coast. And that is going to run right through Lakota country. And so promises made become promises broken. And within 60 years, like by the time our family is homesteading in 1908 and planting their first crop, the Lakota are living on just 2% of what they had reserved for their own use less than 60 years earlier. And the impact was so big, not just in the land taking. If you can go to the next slide, I think this is such a hard photo to see. Does anyone in the audience ever seen this picture before? You can raise your hand. Yeah, some of you have. Those are buffalo skulls. And you can see it's like 2 stories high. Have you seen this photo before? This photo's from about the early 1890s. And so part of the United States and the railroads problem was that also there are millions of buffalo living on the Great Plains. There's an estimate that's a very big number range, but like potentially when white people first arrive in America, there's something like between 30 and 60 million buffalo living in this area and living in America. And the railroads in the United States know that the Lakota religion, economy, culture is completely entangled with the buffalo. They call themselves the buffalo people. And they would kill buffalo and really use every piece of the buffalo to survive. Did your ancestors as well rely on the buffalo?
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking to know that systemically, when you go after the resources like that, you know exactly what you're doing.
What you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was this.
It's like not as if you're you're also directly killing people through, battles and wars and everything. But when they went after the food source and you go after the land and you disconnect the people from their land and their food source, it's a very clever way and you do it by treaties and breaking treaties like you're talking about and displacing people and taking them off their land and putting them in new land that they can't live on. It's a very systemic way of disappearing them.
Absolutely. There was a military officer who sort of famously said, kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone.
Yeah,
like they knew exactly what they were doing. And by the time this photo was taken, there's something like 300 buffalo left in North America. I mean, it's just such a small amount.
You said something too about just how they would start seeing like a buffalo carcass with the hide missing, and that people would kill them and just take the white people would just take the hide and sell them, but that they would leave the buffalo to rot. And that was just such a heartbreaking thing for the Lakota, because you used every single piece of that animal in a very sacred way. Yes. And it was just kind of the beginning of this, it's the beginning of the end.
And they wouldn't only do that, they would exactly do that. In fact, when Doug Whitebull was telling me about this, he started crying because it was still to this day so upsetting. They would also take the carcasses and put poison inside the carcass to attract wolves, but it would kill and decimate the entire ecosystem of the Great Plains because birds would eat the meat and then the whole entire natural world is being upended. And of course, it wasn't just taking the buffalo, it wasn't just taking the land. The religion becomes illegal, practicing ritual becomes illegal. Do you call it cultural interruption? I've heard that
Ooh.
term from elders. That it was like this
Wow. No, I
cultural
haven't heard that.
interruption.
Yeah.
I think all the time about how, like, 13 miles away, here are these Jewish immigrants. They are celebrating Shabbat. They're speaking Yiddish. At no point does my family have to stop doing their rituals or change their name in order to be citizens. And yet their Lakota neighbors are being demanded of that to, like, assimilate or or die in many cases. And the taking of their children to boarding schools.
Yeah, you beautifully weave in the true history that we're not really taught in school about that region and the cultural genocide and the boarding schools, the massacres, kind of it's like a different side of the same coin. Yeah. And it's so important. We actually were just talking about this backstage about, like, the importance of non-Indigenous people telling the history as well, even though there have been people that have been, in the community that have spoken about, these stories. There is such an importance for everybody this is your lived experience and your family's lived experience, and to be able to have a perspective of such a close, intimate view into this part of history that we don't really know about is so important, because I think also we have, like, an empathy. We see our own family's histories. My grandfather, was a Holocaust survivor. He went to Israel when it was, brand new, and then came to Canada and was able to build his generational wealth. That's that our family has benefited from, not knowing at all that we were living on, stolen land. So it's really so important to see it from your perspective. You finding out this stuff as we're going through the book and tying it into your own personal experiences. And I might jumping a bit of ahead here, but you say something so interesting about, like, what would you have done? What did your family know? What didn't they know? What do we think people understood? And also that question reminds me of, my grandfather, when I asked him, like, what did people know when the Holocaust was happening? Did you feel, like, did you know it was gonna happen? You felt something, but what was it? And he would tell stories about they couldn't imagine what was coming. And I imagine that for the Lakota people, like, there was talk and they're seeing all these new neighbors and you're seeing this kind of wave of immigration, and there's no way they could have imagined what was coming. So with that, like, what, I guess we think that we would do something differently or hope that we would, and you kind of touch on this a little bit in the book, and I love your answer.
Oh, I have so many things to think about from that at the same time. I mean, one is, I think it's really easy to judge the dead, right? It's easy to say, if I was alive, then I would have known what was going on. I would have protested. I wouldn't have taken this opportunity that caused such harm to Native people. And I have to admit, when I was reading some of the things about my own family history, I found it hard to not, at times in the process, to not judge them. But when I deepened my research and understanding Jewish history, I felt nothing but real compassion, because here are these people coming from a world where the dividing line is Jew versus non-Jew, and they come to America, and here it's about whiteness, and whiteness, as we know, is graded on a curve, and they get to pass, and they're just terrified that they're going to be kicked out of this new land. So on the one hand, I think so much about the racist messaging that they experience when they come to America that just made them kind of, like, I realized I wouldn't have done anything differently probably than they did. And I don't know that I would have seen the situation any differently than they did. And at the same time, I think so much about, well, what did they know? And there's an elder named Judge Abby Abenanti, and she's a Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation in Northern California. I wrote a profile about her for The Nation magazine before this book was a book. And has become a mentor to me in my life. And her conversations with her are sort of threaded through the book. And at one point, I said to her this question, like, what do you think my ancestors knew? And she said two things that are so her. She's very compassionate in the way she runs her courtroom. And she's very honest. And so she said, everyone knew what was happening to Indians. And then in the next breath, she said to me, but when you're running for your life in terror, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation, you know? So it's going to take several generations of not living with what we today call trauma and the handed down trauma to be able to step into this history, to see it. And she said, so that's why it's right that you and your brother and your cousins are doing this now. It's time, you know? But I try and hold in the book and in my mind all of that at once, you know?
I want to ask you to read a part from the book about the stolen beam.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Just to set it up. No, it's great. Just to set it up. So another thing Judge Abby told me that really changed my life, frankly, is she said, you know, if you're going to write these entangled histories of Jewish immigrants and Native Americans, you really have to grapple with what do you do about it today. Don't just tell the story. That's very important, but think about how you respond. How do you take responsibility in some ways? And she said, we know justice works best when done in a cultural context. And so she said, so study the Jews. What did the Jews say about how to respond to a harm, even when you didn't directly commit, but when you benefited from? And I was really lucky that I didn't have to do that kind of studying on my own. My rabbi, Benjamin Barnett in Portland, Oregon, where I live, he said, this study will be good for our whole community. And so we did have Ruta, this like traditional paired study. We studied the Torah and the Talmud for a couple years, looking for places in these ancient texts that give direction on how to repair. And within the book, it's not everything we learned, but the most powerful pieces of learning are in this book as well. And I guess the only other thing to know, if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a photo behind me, or it will be at some point. This is Doug Whitebull. This is the first day that my cousin Aviva and I met him in Standing Rock in elder housing there. He said, I am the oldest living descendant of the man in that photograph with your Uncle Jack. And knowing Doug has also really changed my life and the way I understand America and my place in it. When Doug was a child growing up on the banks of the Missouri River on the Standing Rock Reservation, there was an successful effort to put a series of dams on the Missouri. This was done for flood control of cities downstream. But its impact was that it flooded communities north of these cities like Bismarck, and the hugest brunt was borne by Native communities. Hundreds and hundreds of Native people have to leave what is the very last best land of those reservations and move inland. And they have to move to an area. I found in a congressional record report this Lakota elder saying to Congress, where you have us living now, it's so dry, even the jackrabbit brings us lunchbox when he comes to visit.
Oh my goodness.
So it was really, but a little bit of that land never was flooded, and Doug and I went and visited the land where he grew up. So I'm going to read to you, and this is a photo that his nephew Frank Whitebull took of him. It's probably 10 or 15 years old now of Doug, but this is what he's on that land in Kennel near the Missouri River. Thanks for listening. One day, Doug, myself, and one of Doug's former students, Jeff McLaughlin, drive out to visit what's left of the place where Doug grew up on the edge of the Missouri River. There aren't any roads to get there. Up and down over buttes, we off-road in an old minivan that Jeff calls his Vuck. It's a truck and a van. Get it? He asks me with a quick, shy smile. Jeff, like many former students, calls Doug Lakeshee, Lakota, for uncle. As we near the cut bank, far above the deep blue water, red chokecherries and wild plum cluster in the folds and creases of the land. When we reach the grassy slope where Doug used to run barefoot with his sisters, I ask him how it feels. Feels great. Feels like home, he says, closing his eyes under the bright sun. Swallows swoop through the sky. The air is filled with birdsong and the buzz of insects, the river, and the wind. But for the moment, I'm not noticing any of that. I'm distracted by our effort to touch the past. An old cemetery, fenced off and thick with chokecherry, has survived the flood. While it had been slated for removal, the water never got that high, and the feds, by neglect or delay, left it alone. Deep inside the thicket of wild plants are gravestones of Doug's relatives, and he is determined to visit. Getting there will require this blind old man, who relies on his cane as if it were a third limb, to do the equivalent of bushwhacking. I explained to Doug where to put his foot and how to hold on to my arm and Jeff's arm. I'm embarrassed to share this part, but it's what happened. On the audio file, you can hear my voice asking if this is a good idea, cautioning Doug to be careful. Jeff quietly helps Doug step over the wire fence, gets a camp chair out of the van, and sets it up in the shade in case Doug needs a break. I should have known better. By this point, I knew a lot of Doug's stories, especially his greatest hits, such as the time he, as a teenager, ran a 50-mile race, finishing with bloody feet. I knew about his time at boarding school, where he was repeatedly hit and kicked by his teachers, sometimes with a wooden board across his bottom, for the crime of speaking Lakota or not making his bed correctly. I knew he'd survived all that and become a straight A student anyway. Not a person given to giving up. Doug slowly but steadily traverses the weedy expanse from the van to the graves deep in the middle of the cemetery. He never slows down, never complains. Standing as close as we can get to the old stones, the words in the marble etched in Lakota, I read the inscription aloud to Doug, and he translates. Here was Mary Whitebull, who died May 18th, 1902, at the age of 4. The shade of the chokecherry makes patches across our faces. As Doug takes a moment to contemplate the graves, I'm struck again by the weight of his loss, of what has been taken from him and his family to ensure a specific brand of American progress. There's a debate described in the Talmud between two rabbis over what should be done if it's discovered that a house or even a palace was built using a stolen beam as part of its foundation. One rabbi says the entire building must be demolished so that the beam can be returned to its original owners. The other rabbi says the building can remain standing if the full value of the beam is repaid. Both rabbis make clear that as soon as it is known that the beam was stolen, those living in the house must do something. They must make amends. Our country was built on a stolen beam. Rabbi Sharon Brous of Los Angeles famously said in a 2017 sermon, "To ignore this history and the legacy of this history diminishes the legitimacy and the power of this house, of this nation." The money that has come to the Lakota was arguably never a fair trade for what was taken, rarely a deal negotiated without some degree of coercion. And the losses compound one another. The flooding of Doug's childhood home here on the banks of the Missouri, built on the taking of his father's land, and his grandfather's land, and his father's before that. And what of everything else that was stolen? The years Doug spent in fear at boarding school, the state-mandated destruction of Lakota language, religion, and culture. What payment can be made to replace such a loss? Thank you.
Wow. So that makes me think of something we've spoken about a lot, which is my Saba, who was one of the privileged Jews who received reparations. as a Holocaust survivor. And I knew that growing up. I knew that he got checks, and I knew that when my grandmother passed away, he got her checks. And
they were from Germany.
yes. Yeah. And I knew this as kind of this happening for a lot of Jewish families. I know there was a lot of Jews that got, left out, and, unfortunately their families were not, that wasn't an acknowledged piece of their history. But I always felt, as an Indigenous person, wow, what would that look like if our communities had reparations? There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of assumptions about not paying taxes and going to school for free and all of these things that are very
assumptions that white people
Yes.
have about Native people.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Which are very dangerous, because I think it contributes to this idea like we got off scot-free and like benefited greatly from.
As if the treaties are really upheld.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about those two things in terms of like reparations, and you talk a lot about like repair and healing, and even being in, communities, BIPOC communities myself, and hearing this like wonder from other communities about what that must be like, the privilege of having the world acknowledge your genocide and how powerful that is, and being taught about it. And like, I've been to Germany, and the kids, they learn it, and there's not a shame about it. There's a responsibility.
It's a law that
Yeah.
they have to teach it in their schools.
And they're very proud of, when I meet, when I've worked with young students, they're very proud of what they know. And there's a sense of shame in America, and there's a sense of shame in Canada of like, we don't want to feel bad about it anymore. Like, isn't it enough? Like, haven't we heard enough about it? Kind of.
Like, isn't that in the past?
Yes.
Haven't we moved on from that? It happened.
Yes.
Right.
And it's interesting to read this book, and it's very recent history, and it affects Indigenous communities all over North America every single day. And when you're talking about, this reconciliation, I'm interested, first of all, of how your family decided to move through the discomfort of it, and knowing what you know now, and how it's led your family to move forward. And also how we as Jews can better repair our relationship with the land that we're on, and the communities who we don't have any relationship with.
Just small questions.
Can you do that in like 2 minutes?
Super easy, yeah. So the question first of how did I come to think about how to respond? And I think if you read the book, you'll see it wasn't at all one thing by any means, but Maimonides, this ancient Jewish philosopher and rabbi who we still study today, he scripted something called the Laws of Repentance. And I think they really still have such truth and wisdom for us living today, even though they're hundreds and hundreds of years old. One of the things he says is, well, first you stop doing the harm. That's the first step. And frankly, you can argue that in America and probably in Canada, the harm is ongoing. The legacy of the boarding schools, the legacy of cultural interruption, it's still ongoing. There are still actions that are happening now systemically that are direct. The second thing is tell the truth out loud. And in ways, this book is my effort to do that, tell the truth out loud. But it doesn't end with that. And instructively, in Maimonides, you don't say you're sorry. You don't apologize till like the fourth or fifth step. And in between is taking action to try and make it right with the people who have been harmed from what they would want. And that led me to have many conversations with Lakota elders, in particular the White Bull family, And it took a couple years of knowing Doug. I kept asking this question, and he kept kind of ignoring me. And it took about 2 years of knowing him before he said, he's a former teacher and coach, and he's a good teacher. He never tells you what to do or the answer, but he reminded me again about these efforts. So for the Lakota, the Black Hills of South Dakota, a place they call why am I blanking? Hey Sapa, is as important for the Lakota as Israel is for many Jews. It is their spiritual homeland. It is their creation stories come from the idea that humans emerged from the Black Hills, the land itself. And even the United States Supreme Court in 1980 ruled that the United States had taken that land unfairly and never paid for the land. Well, the Lakota don't want that money. In 1980, the Supreme Court said you have to pay millions of dollars to the Lakota Nation. The Lakota Nation, 4 of the 10 poorest counties in America today are in Lakota country. They don't want those billions. It's literally over $1 billion at this point. They want the land. And there's an old saying, you don't sell your mother. We can't sell that land. My friend Wayne Ducheneau said, we don't talk about owning land. We live with the land. We don't live on it. We live with the land. Anyway, there is an incredible organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation that's Indigenous-led. It's been around for over 30 years, helping Native nations reclaim some of their land. And they are as quietly as private land comes up for sale in the Black Hills, they're buying that land and holding it in trust for Lakota, anyone of the Lakota Nation to use for ceremony to go and be with. So my family started a fund at the Land Tenure Foundation, and I set our fundraising goal at $1.1 million because that's how much money we got from our land and mortgages. We've not raised $1.1 million, but we have raised a lot of money, and it's been really amazing. Readers are sending in checks to this fund. People all over the country, I think, are feeling inspired. I by no means want to say this is how we do reparation. Clearly, there is such a need for federal response. This was federal policy. This was intentional American efforts. But there is not a single congressperson today leading any effort at all on how to even do a truth and reconciliation effort like has been done in Canada. Biden finally recently apologized. He was the first president to publicly apologize in a speech in front of people and humans for what happened with the boarding schools. I mean, again, this history is not far away, and we still have such a long way to go. And I guess I'm just impatient to wait around for the feds to finally do something. And so my family's effort is one of many efforts happening in communities around the country and in families to try and say, what can we do now? And in the back of my book, I have some guidance of what people are doing and ways to find yourself in this history that I hope might be helpful if this is a question that you are interested in. How do we as Jews heal in a more deep way? Yeah, I think we are lucky as Jews in that we have a culture and a religion that has such wisdom around this. How do we live in right community? There is so much beautiful teaching about measuring our distance to harms and taking action and repair. And I think it's relevant to what is happening in the world right now, that teaching.
On that, you speak about the massacre at Wounded Knee.
Yeah.
From accounts that you mentioned haven't really been publicly read.
I found in the oral history, there's this incredible trove of oral histories at the University of South Dakota that were taken with survivors of the massacre in the 70s. So that the massacre happened in, was it 1890?
Which is not the side we hear things from.
No, and so I tried to report on what happened there, not from the white telling, but from this, and actually some soldiers, the white soldiers who had been at the massacre and done the killing and shooting. There was interviews with them too, so they're in there as well.
There's a very graphic,
It's so sad.
image that you speak about a woman who's been killed with the baby on her back and the baby crawling on her trying to breastfeed. And as 7 months postpartum, that was really hard to read. And we have to carry, the grief of these stories. And I think as Jews, we carry it. And for me, for my mother's family, I carry it from that perspective. And it really makes me think about what's happening in Gaza and Israel and the babies who were taken and the babies who are dying. And I feel complicated. We talk about this, about how in our own trauma and fear that we've learned to live with as Jews, how we can still hold space for the people we may be the aggressors to, whether it's in America or, I don't have the answers, but we do, discuss this because I think both we're on the same page of saying there has to be some deep healing. There's so much division in our community. And, how do you feel? And I know that you've gone on book tour and I know that people want to talk about Israel. And, I think both you and I, there's the instinct to say, let's avoid it because it's very painful for a lot of people. But it's very hard to read this book and not say, oh my goodness, how can we look at how we've perpetrated harms and make those connections.
So this book came out October 3rd last year. And I am not a Middle East scholar. And yet the Middle East scholars that I am in touch with and talk to have said, these histories are not the same. What has happened in America is not the same as what has happened in the Middle East. And you can get into trouble really quickly from a truth-telling perspective if you want to put those together. That said, there are so many rhymes and resonances. And I think so many readers have told me that they have found themselves in the book, in the questions that are alive for them in this moment. They are thinking about them today, and that the book somehow has helped them to grapple in some ways with what's happening in Israel and in Gaza and in the West Bank by thinking about the book in America. And I think, I wish, of course, we all want there to be an easy answer to this question of what do we do today and what do we do as Jews living in America. And yet what I hope the book does and what I hope is a conversation we can start to have more and more is how do we get past binary thinking? How do we embrace the fact that we can be both oppressed and oppressors, victims and victimizers, that both can be happening if we can hold compassion for the hostages, for the Gazans, for Israelis who descend from Holocaust survivors and other oppressive places, and also say, how do we take responsibility and find a way to be peaceful, to hold it all. I see so much on social media that is very flat. I know we both do. We're in this sort of, both of us see a real range of perspectives just from who we are and the communities we both move in. And I find them, I'm always longing for some more nuance and complexity. Not as a way to say, I hate it when people say, oh, it's just so complicated, as if let's not even try and move forward. That's not what I'm saying. How do you hold complexity and nuance to actually find a way to take responsibility and engage in those conversations far more deeply? I mean, anyway, there's so much more to say. I'm going to be signing books if anyone wants. We have just a few minutes, and I want to make space for Q&A, just for a couple. We probably only have time for a couple, but I see a hand go straight up. Thank you all for being here today. Yes, go ahead.
My grandmother came in 1907 from Kiev, escaping pogroms, and went to Baltimore. And from the time she was a very young girl, she was obsessed with the West. And as I started to, she moved in with us, I got a little older, she had piles of books of all of the Westerns that were written in the 50s and 60s and 40s. And then she'd watch every Western movie, but her thing was, she always wanted the Native Americans to win.
I love that.
It was like, I mean, I think maybe she read all those books because she was waiting for that in some way. And I think she just really, I sometimes say she just was a very old soul in some way, that very early on she saw a connection between what she and her family went through with what she came to.
Yes.
And even though she felt probably very lucky, she just right away recognized, whoa, this is the same
That is so,
exact thing.
and I can't tell you how many older, elder Native people who find such resonance between their experience and the Jewish story. It's really, it's not the same story, but there is a history of resilience and oppression both in both of our communities. And I think there's a lot of history of Native activists over the years looking to Jews to say, look how they did it, look how they survived. And we can look to their story and find inspiration, actually. Yeah. I do. Any other questions? Maybe one or two. The question was, who settled the land around our ancestors? So it was a lot of, interestingly, they were German-speaking Russians. There's like this huge swath of people who settled in South Dakota who were Germans who left Germany, came to Russia for one generation, and then got also in the upheaval of the pogroms and everything, that as immigrants, they had to leave again, and they came to America. So they were around. There were Irish immigrants. There were also just people who had been born in America who came out and wanted just a chance at a better life. And so there were all these, but the Jews, there were about 70 Jews, about 30-ish Jewish homesteading sites. But they weren't contiguous, so they were sort of surrounded around then, yeah.
I think we have to...
Unfortunately, it sounds like we're done. But thank you so much for being here. And
Thank you so
Sarah.
much. Thank you.